Under the blazing sun at Pier 7, the Navy's most advanced warship had sat lifeless, its billion-dollar systems frozen. For 3 days, every technician, engineer, and officer had tried and failed to bring it back to life. Deadlines had passed. Tempers had flared. Then, just when everyone had given up, a rusted pickup had rolled through the gate. Out had stepped an 84-year-old man with a cane, a worn cap, and a toolbox older than the ship itself. The young officers had laughed until the Admiral saluted him. What happened next had silenced the entire base forever. Before we dive in, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? By the time the 3rd day passed and the USS Zumwalt still sat dead in the water, like a wounded beast tethered to Pier 7, every engineer, technician, and systems officer on Fort Brenton's roster had tried and failed to breathe life back into her. With internal diagnostics looping into infinite failure states, digital overrides freezing mid-command, and propulsion failsafes locking up like a clenched jaw just seconds after partial activation, while rumors spread like fuel fire among the deckhands that the entire ship might be scrapped or secretly reassigned as a permanent dock installation to avoid embarrassment, because this wasn't just any vessel. It was the pride of next-gen naval warfare, a $4 billion emblem of sleek dominance, now rendered mute and useless by a fault no algorithm could locate, no technician could define, and no officer dared admit publicly. And in the operations tent where tension choked the air, Admiral Peter Wells stood hunched over classified system printouts, his coffee gone cold, his temper colder, and his senior officers exchanging sideways glances as he reread the same red-flagged sentence in every engineering report. Critical systems inoperative, root cause unknown, until a snide young lieutenant named Mason muttered, "Might as well call a retirement home next," prompting nervous laughter that died the moment Wells looked up and said without blinking, "Call Franklin Callahan." And in that instant the mood turned, the air shifted, because the name wasn't part of any current chain of command, but carried a weight that made seasoned chiefs glance up from their monitors, as if someone had whispered a ghost's name. And though Mason scoffed and asked, "Who's he, some old grease monkey?" Wells only replied, "He's the reason most of the fleet still floats." And 10 hours later, under a pale dawn sky, a rust-bitten Ford pickup rattled into the base with a weathered old man behind the wheel, his cane resting beside a toolbox that hadn't seen a conveyor belt or digital scanner in its life, a faded cap reading USS Saratoga on his head, and a glint in his storm-gray eyes that said he wasn't here to reminisce. And when the gate guards hesitated, it was Wells himself who met him, saluted first, and walked him through the security lines like royalty, past stunned crews and stone-faced officers who'd all been briefed in silence that help was coming, but not in the form they expected. And as Franklin Red Callahan stepped onto the deck, he didn't speak, didn't pose, didn't explain. He simply placed his hand on the steel bulkhead, listened and muttered, "She's afraid," before requesting 5 things: a manual with all red-line edits, a chalkboard, a cup of strong coffee, complete silence on deck, and the removal of every technician who thought more in code than combustion. And while half the room whispered about senility and publicity stunts, Red was already diagramming fluid flow physics from memory, muttering about resonance frequencies no one had calculated, and tracing his fingers along conduit lines until he found a hairline crack near the APU bleed valve that every diagnostic had missed, because it only vibrated when power, surged at 71%, a variable no test dared, reached because systems crashed at 70.2%, and when Mason, still smirking, challenged him by saying, "What are you gonna do, rub it with a wrench and hope it heals?" Red didn't answer. He simply pulled out a tuning fork, struck it against steel, placed it to the hull, and closed his eyes as the ship sang her pain back to him in the kind of wail only engine whisperers could hear. And what followed was a 9-hour surgery on machinery no textbook had ever fully diagrammed, during which Red refused digital tools, saying, "They're blind when it matters," instead using calipers, heat chalk, and fingertip pressure to realign the harmonic compression manifold with the faith of a surgeon operating without anesthesia. And when he emerged, streaked in oil and sweat, he handed Wells a dirty napkin with scribbled instructions. Restart with manual override. Throttle up to 74%. Hold for 90 seconds. Then cut power completely for 2 beats. She'll cough. Then breathe. And every officer watching assumed it would fail. Until the moment came, the bridge followed his sequence, and the ship didn't groan or stall or stutter. It roared. It surged. It vibrated like a beast woken from chains, and all across the base, alarms flickered green and systems reinitialized. Propulsion kicked into standby, guidance gyros realigned, and for the first time in 78 hours, the Zumwalt was operational, and the silence that followed was heavier than gunfire, as dozens stood dumbfounded before Red, who only asked, "Now, do you want her to fight or just look pretty?" And before anyone could answer, a convoy of black vehicles rolled onto the pier, and out stepped the Vice Admiral and a congressional aide, both expecting disaster, ready to pull funding and reassign command, only to be greeted by a ship that shone like chrome vengeance, and a crew standing at attention around an old man, holding a rusted wrench and a smile like thunderclouds before a storm. And when the Admiral asked, "Who gave this man authority to override standard systems?" Red replied, "The ship did." And that was the moment everything turned. The Vice Admiral shook his hand and whispered something only Wells heard. Something about medals buried under politics and names erased by digital overconfidence. And then the Admiral stepped back and called for cameras, for citations, for honors that Red neither asked for nor stayed to receive, because by the time the official ceremony was planned, Red was already halfway to the truck, toolbox in hand, ready to disappear again into the forgotten corners of American steel and memory. But not before Mason ran after him, breathless, and asked, "Sir, would you teach me?" And Red paused, looked at him long, and said, "Only if you're ready to be humbled by bolts." And that day, in the shadow of the mighty Zumwalt, a new legend was born, not of systems, but of souls, of men who carry the memory of machines in their hands, and treat every circuit not as code, but as trust. And as Red drove away, radio humming static blues, Wells stood at the edge of the pier watching him disappear, and murmured, "They built this Navy on sweat, not screens," and across the fleet, the name Franklin Callahan echoed again, a myth reborn in grit, silence, and the simple refusal to let a machine die when it could still be saved by hands that remembered how to listen.